future reference, as well as the presentations should be available from the presenters. We're talking about that, and Jody can verify that as well. And then on the agenda, Jody, do you want to go to the next slide, please, if you could? We're going to have the first session today, and we're already a few minutes behind, but we'll catch up there. Is going to be on post-fire management, and we'll have a presentation by Jonathan Long, Michael Hentz, Karuna Greenberg, Chris Dunn, and then question and answer for that. On the second part of the second session today, will be presenting by Linnea Quinn Davidson, Margot Robbins, and Will Harling, and we'll be addressing that. And in the last part of our session 3 today on Indigenous fire research on these topics, we'll be hearing from Tony Marks Blocks, Clark Knight, and then a few wrap-up thoughts of myself. And that's generally how we're going to have it. So we'll have the presenters, we'll have encourage specific questions to those presenters within their time, and then we'll have the panelists more of an open session theme, question and answer dialogue at the end, and that type of information. So hopefully with that, we'll also be, just want to make sure logistic wise, we'll be taking a lunch break between 12 and 12:30. I believe that's when we have that. And then we'll be trying to start back and then gain our time on keeping up with the session today. So unless there's other questions for me or logistics, I guess we'd say go ahead and please put those in the question and answer, and both Jody, who's the WKRP coordinator, or Luna or myself will be trying to figure that out. So with that, I appreciate everybody for joining today. Look forward to great topics and our presenters, and who are really appreciative of all those that are taking the time to be here with us today and share their knowledge and their experience and their information with fire and the climates. So if Karuna's on board and here, then Karuna, I'll turn it over to you as the moderator of your post-fire management session here, and then we'll start with Jonathan.
All right, how does that screen look?
Looks great, Jonathan.
Okay. All right, well, thanks. I'm a research ecologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station. I've worked on a couple of the science syntheses, including the Northwest Forest Plan science synthesis for your area. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you all. The Klamath region is one of the places I often refer other folks to in terms of seeing the cutting edge on fire. I gave a version of this presentation recently to folks on the Mendocino, and they were really interested in climate change and then how that influenced kind of trajectories for the forest. So I put in a few slides at the back end of this that I probably won't necessarily cover, but I did include one picture on the front here of projections for the suitability for large wildfire events in 2100. Basically everything getting much more intense in terms of the likelihood of large fires over the century. But if people are interested in those topics, I can dig into that a little bit more during the Q&A. I had 3 objectives that Frank wanted me to try to cover. One is to mention the post-fire restoration framework, PSW GTR 270, and some associated reports. I do have hard copies of this. If people are interested, they can either email me or maybe put it in the chat, and I can arrange to send those out, or I can send a bunch up to Frank or other folks up there. I was asked to reflect a little bit on the WKRP Post-Fire Management Recommendations Report and kind of how that aligns with some of the work that we've got going, and then also talk about opportunities to integrate tribal interest in post-fire restoration. And I won't go into too much depth on the restoration framework, just to share that there's case studies from 3 different types of systems, including conifer forest and also a couple different kinds of shrub dominated ecosystems. A lot of the emphasis is on figuring out kind of where you really need to take different kinds of management actions to restore trajectories toward desired conditions, and where conditions after a fire are pretty much in line where you want to go, and you're just trying to either maintain or promote that trajectory. And then there's a lot of interest from the climate change side of things to look at the need to potentially reevaluate desired conditions given projections for climate change, making it less likely to sustain certain vegetation types. I'm going to go a little bit more into those topics in terms of the influence of climate change. We're expecting to see more frequent large and severe wildfires, more drought, more insect mortality, and all those can lead to increasing likelihood of regeneration failure for conifer trees. With more tree mortality, we can see greater amounts of surface fuels and potential for more severe reburns when fire comes back through, if those areas are not treated in different ways, and potentially fewer seed sources. And all that in turn can lead to fewer mature trees, more hardwoods and shrubs in larger patches, and in particular concern for a lot of the parts of California and Sierra Nevada is reductions in yellow pines. So this is from some of my colleagues who published a paper just kind of explaining the concept of state shift, where you can have persistent loss of historical conifer forest after decades of fire exclusion with increasing tree density and fuels, wildfire coming through after that, shrubs inhibiting the conifer growth, increased surface fuels. And then a lot of the concern is around the potential for the reburns that may kill the regenerating trees and really knock back your lack of seed source. Another kind of state shift that we're concerned about is the loss of mature hardwoods. So even climate change is expected to promote many of our oak species. We're concerned about the loss of mature hardwoods and the services they provide in terms of acorns, large cavities. And on the right, there is a picture of a black oak that's twice burned and resprouted in 12 years. And it actually did make acorns in the 11th year, although it's uncertain how much viability you'll have off those acorns. But in this fire up in Northern California, we had 2 wildfires within 12 years. And so it knocked out that reproduction. And so the rationales for interventions are to help shift some of these trajectories where it may be helpful, and in particular, reducing the future surface woody fuels that could drive high severity reburns, increasing opportunities for using intentional fire sooner. So that's one of the key factors, is making it managers and communities more supportive of getting fire back into some of these fire footprints. And reducing the fuels can make that easier to achieve. Also planting in areas that are distant from seed sources, especially the interiors of large high severity patches, that can give a boost to the conifer trees over the shrubs and hardwood competing vegetation, and promote recovery of large trees for future wildlife habitat and seed sources. Another rationale for planting is to enhance the revegetation with trees that are better suited for warming climate, more fire or disease. So in some cases, planting white pines that are resistant to white pine blister rust, or accentuating the amount of yellow pines that might not be there under a purely natural regeneration framework. And on the right, I'm giving an example of one of the burns that was done up in your area within the footprint of a wildfire to reduce fuels. So those opportunities to reduce future woody fuels are often linked to salvage, but there are some alternatives that people are trying out and using fire. A main point that we think about whenever we're talking about post-fire interventions is considering the social context. So understanding the importance of WUI, residential properties, different ownerships, travel corridors, power lines, campgrounds, recreation areas, all those things are going to factor into kind of what the approaches are going to be in different areas. And those are also not a real focus of a lot of the research investigations, because these are often pretty idiosyncratic. But I think it's really important to be thinking about how these different social values come into play. We've got a follow-up to our report that lays out 10 zones that we kind of are thinking about when we look at some of these large high severity fires. So first starting and looking at the large high severity patches, then talking about what opportunities there are in smaller high severity patches, what to do in moderate, mixed, low severity, ridges, oak groves, riparian areas, meadows, high elevation forest, and then pine oak transitions, or areas that are kind of on the trailing edge for climate, where we are more likely to see a loss of conifer forest associated with climate change. And this framework, I've been thinking a lot about opportunities for integrating tribal stewardship practices. Many of these features have tribal special cultural significance. I'm just highlighting a few here, but ridge lines, meadows, oak groves were all going to be traditionally targeted for cultural burning. Riparian areas and shrubs are supporting a lot of plants that are particularly important. So, tribal considerations extend throughout the landscape, but I think it's important to think about some of these zones that often aren't the kind of first priority in post-fire restoration plans that are coming out. There's often a gravitation toward the large high severity patches, and these other systems are often kind of more minor considerations because they represent smaller parts of the landscape, but they can be very important to think about. Here's some considerations for the Western Klamath report, where I saw a lot of convergence between some of the work we've done, especially the idea of retaining hardwoods and large trees, adjusting planting targets based on topography, especially on the south-facing slopes in terms of the kind of desired tree densities, considering thresholds of high severity patch size when prioritizing salvage and replanting, the topic of potential for tree tipping as a way to bring down some of the dead trees, but still retain their benefits in terms of large woody material for streams, considering the special planting needs, identifying and maintaining strategic control features. I know Chris is going to be talking shortly about those topics, maintaining the recent fire footprints with appropriate fire intervals. There was a few areas where I based on my experience and other science we've looked at, there's a lot of progress on looking at erosion control methods, and some of the methods that have been used historically, including grass seeding and aerial mulching and things like that, have been a little bit less out of favor. Even contour felling of log barriers, but there's a growing interest in the idea of treating some of the fuels and then mixing some of the materials that are being processed to provide extra ground cover in areas where you have special erosion control concerns. So I think that's something that can be looked at. Also, I think it's important, we've talked a lot about in the Northwest Forest Plan science synthesis, to consider the potential for beneficial effects of erosion by rejuvenating in-stream habitat. There's often kind of an assumption that erosion is necessarily a problem, but in a lot of our areas, we've kind of shut off the supply of sediment and the rejuvenating effects that post-fire conditions can have. We've got some research going on in the basin. We're looking at percent slope because there's interest in being able to treat on steeper slopes to reduce some of the fire risks in those areas and promote other restoration goals. And we're seeing in some of our modeling that we're doing and other review that slope is not as important as soil type potentially. And then a big point is that a lot of research has kind of highlighted, only doing salvage and things like high severity burning areas. But there's, I think, a greater awareness now that while planting may not be a priority in low to moderate burn areas, treatments to reduce fuels may still be needed in those areas because we often get a lot of smaller trees that are dead in those areas. And so kind of unnaturally high fuel levels that are going to make it hard to get fire back into those areas. Another idea that from my work in Arizona with tribal lands was considering removing undersized culverts after fires in order to avoid the stream crossing failures that can happen. I'll go through just a few slides on some of these different zones where we've got some examples. One is this question of how large does a high severity patch need to be in order to warrant intervention? And when you start to look at different parameters for understanding the size of a high severity patch, these numbers, you kind of whittle down the amount of area that you might really prioritize for intervention. So this is an example from the King Fire where you had 41% of the fire was in high severity patches. And you can see there was some giant patch through the middle of that fire. But only 31% of the area was in high severity areas that were conifer beforehand. And only 17% were in areas that were more than 120 meters from conifer that had burned at low to moderate severity. So an assumption that there's green trees within 120 meters in some of those other areas. So you can see this is kind of whittling down the area that might be the highest priorities. And then you can factor in kind of the relationship to shrubs in the surrounding area and what the different goals are. But I think it's important to understand that just because you have high severity fire, it's not necessarily a sign that you have to go do interventions. There are some tools that have been developed, and this is an example from the ranch fire on the Mendocino where people applied our framework, our colleagues in the R5 ecology program, to try to identify areas where the patches were larger than the natural range of variability, and those are shown in red. And then the areas that are in green are high severity or other kinds of severities that burned in smaller patches. So it again whittles down the area that you might need to really prioritize for your initial kind of fuel reduction and replanting. There's some other tools that have been developed to predict conifer regeneration. And this is another example where the brown areas here show areas that are kind of a relatively low probability of regeneration within small plots 5 years after fire. So she found about 22% of the areas that were yellow pine mixed conifer had less than 60% probability. This is an example from the August fire. We're overlaying the high severity with the vegetation beforehand. So you can again see that the brown hardwood forest and black non-forest vegetation kind of breaks up some of that high severity patch to makes it look a little bit kind of more manageable. The idea of treating in moderate severity areas. This is an example on the right here of an area where they did do some salvage to reduce some of the fuels in an area that burned at moderate severity. So there were a lot of dead trees, but there was also a lot of live trees. And then on the left here is another example of an area that burned at that kind of severity where you have a lot of dead trees that could contribute to higher intensity reburns. And we've got work going on the Power Fire where they're putting in low severity or prescribed fire in low severity burn areas. The managers there have been reluctant to put the prescribed fires in moderate severity burn areas due to lack of fuel reductions. And on the right, there's an example of one of the black oak groves that are on the Power Fire where prescribed fire could be a real opportunity to enhance the potential for acorn harvest and for wildlife and for people. Ridge lines are really important to be thinking about. And I mentioned that and Chris is going to be talking about the PODS framework. These are often really complex mixes of burn severity and vegetation types. And so we've got examples from your region where they're maintaining the oaks and large conifers in ways that facilitate fire management, but it's not just creating kind of a cleared out fuel break. Looking at opportunities for restoring meadows based on fire. I think this is a really interesting topic. I know you've got a lot of areas that have meadows that have been encroached, and we see National Forest doing these really complicated projects to try to cut out the trees from some of these meadows. It'll be interesting to see the opportunities for high severity fire to actually provide some of these restorative benefits. Riparian areas are very complex, but I think that the main perspective here is not necessarily to assume that these should be hands-off zones. This is an example from the Rim Fire where we had habitat for old forest specialists on Corral Creek. It burned really hot through here. And it's basically shifted over to shrub dominated area. They did do some salvage because this is also along a road corridor. But anyway, it presents interesting opportunities to talk about erosion control needs, loading to streams, as well as future fire risks and the desire to regrow some of this old forest habitat that was lost. And I mentioned the idea of the trailing edge forests that are vulnerable to transitions from conifer mixes with hardwoods to oak dominated. And this may be an appropriate shift in some areas, but it's important to be looking at what the potential is factoring in climate. And on the right here is an example of an area where oak and maple are basically resprouting, and they may not expect a lot of conifer regen. And this again is the link to the post-fire restoration framework. And I think with that, I will pause and give my time, or if there's time for questions, I can do that.
Thank you, Jonathan. Since we got started 10 minutes late, and you still were within your allocated time, if there's any specific questions for Jonathan, I would encourage people to use the Q&A feature. And I hadn't seen any in there. So without that, I think if there's nothing specifically to Jonathan, then we'll move on to Michael Hintz for the Slater Fire Post Fire. Yes.
This is Will. I did see there were some questions in the chat, one from Jamie Allen. Hi, Jamie. Saying, I'm very much interested in naturalized regen versus human aid and key components of what that might be for restoration of landscapes and watersheds post mega fires.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's a really cutting edge topic right now. I mentioned some of the tools that we have developed to kind of predict the likelihood of getting conifer regeneration, but there's all these issues around the species composition mix that you want to factor in, the planting densities, and just understanding kind of what the potential is for bringing back the kind of forest, and then really understanding what your reference conditions are, because we know that a lot of the areas probably had a lot more trees than we would have historically. So understanding kind of where are those parts of the landscape where it really makes sense to try to ensure that we've got conifers coming back in, and where the reductions in conifers may be really restorative.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. We'll save the rest of the question and answer for the panel presenters at the end. Thank you, Jonathan. We appreciate it. And Michael Hintz, if you're ready to go, your screen sharing or how you're going to do that, but you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Hintz. I'm here in Happy Camp, and I work for the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council. I was tasked to pick up a presentation from Earl Crosby, as he couldn't be here. And it's a little bit of a slideshow with some aerial videography, and it's a little clunky, the editing. So I really apologize in advance. This subject is the Slater Fire. And this, of course, was quite a devastating fire to our community and our natural resources. It started in September of 2020, I believe September 8th. I think I'm just going to start the video. I'm going to do a little bit of talking, but it's kind of just a visual survey of the Slater Fire. It's only about 3 or so minutes. So just kind of sit back and take a look. So the Slater Fire was a wind-driven fire event. It happened extraordinarily fast. I think it's still under investigation, but there really was no warning. We didn't have thunderstorms to let us know that a fire was coming. There wasn't human ignition that was known in advance. and it moved with devastating speed throughout, especially the Indian Creek watershed, but it was not restricted just to that. It spilled into the Klamath and other neighboring watersheds to the south and all the way up into Oregon. We're going to see a picture of the Klamath corridor, and I'm not going to get too much into details of post-fire management, but this was a thinning project done, I believe, by Caltrans along Highway 96. And we're just going to be seeing some of the recent activity on the ground. A lot of this aerial imagery was actually shot yesterday by me. A lot of the work that was done that I was able to document followed the power line corridors, the road corridors, and residential areas. I did not travel deep into the forest to capture these images. This is looking south back towards the town of Happy Camp with the Marble Mountain Wilderness in the background. Of course, equipment use and soil compaction, road building are going to be key things to be concerned with. This is actually an interesting minor success story in the sense that this green patch of forest was actually thinned by the landowner, and we did prescribed fire in the stand. But unfortunately, it's a very rare success story within the Slater Fire footprint. Many people lost their homes who lived in the Indian Creek watershed, including my parents, in-law, my wife's parents. This is the east fork of the Indian Creek watershed. This is post-fire logging on private land we're looking at. And this is just a set of still imagery looking at the current conditions of the Indian Creek watershed. Many locals lament that we do not have a sawmill to be able to utilize these materials, both from post-fire logging, but also generally to have a good forest industry here in Happy Camp. This is a local church that was devastated by the fire. A local private bridge over Indian Creek. And an old teepee burner in the background. And these are my wife's parents who spent 3 days within the fire itself. They lived so remotely that they just escaped into the creek and had to hunker down for 3 days. And that was a picture of them just when they came out. So that's just a little visual overview, everyone. And again, I'm filling in for Earl Crosby, but I really appreciate being able to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that video and picture show there of the Slater Fire. We do have a few minutes. If anybody wants to have any questions specifically to Mike on this, please enter those in the question and answer, or others are going to be monitoring the chat. But we do prefer the question and answer box for the panelists and their presentation specific content. While we're waiting, Michael, any other reflections about continued monitoring and other things of the burn scar area?
Oh, reflections. Well, I was up there yesterday collecting some of these images, and it is quite devastating. Personally, and for the community, I think a lot of us are going to be directly affected by this for a long time. It is such a large area with such high severity. It is requires a very high level of management sophistication to try to build back some of the natural resource values that I think have been really compromised by the fire. But it's been really traumatic, and I feel like I'm not quite up to the task to be the voice of this event, as it's so close to heart for so many of us.
Well, thank you. And again, sorry for your loss and the trauma you still carry from that. I know you've been through a few of them there on either side of the happy camp.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Michael, for your presentation and sharing that content. I do see Karuna is here. So Karuna, would you go ahead and like to take the floor? Thank you. Oh,
Yes. Let me just share my screen.
and while we're doing that, there was one question and answer I missed that we can get back about invasive species sprouting back along roadside thinning areas from Bill Tripp. So we'll try to address that at the panel. Thank you.
Sorry, are people seeing my screen there? Or is it still just part of a screen?
I look to be seeing what is a PDF of the page 5 of 13 of the document.
Great. Okay. My name is Karina Greenberg. I am the Restoration Director for the Salmon River Restoration Council. And I also have the privilege of being a co-lead for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And today I'm going to be just laying out some of the elements of our recently completed post-fire management recommendations. To start off, I just wanted to go over some of the motivation for putting out this document of post-fire management recommendations. And as you just saw, the 2020 wildfire season was pretty intense all around the state, and it was locally very devastating. The Slater Fire burned over 157,000 acres, and nearly 200 homes were lost, with virtually the entire Indian Creek drainage burning at high intensity. And that's, just a huge ecological and social devastation, especially in such a small area. So this really increased our sense of a need to focus on post-fire vision for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And these concepts are things that we have been talking about kind of since the beginning of the partnership. But this really just brought us together that this was something that we critically needed to kind of hammer out and come up with that vision after this last summer. And of course, we're not newcomers to large wildfires in the area. This builds on many large wildfires within WKRP's 1.2 million acre scope. And we really first started kind of developing the bones for this plan after the 2014 wildfires that burned more than 300,000 acres within the WKRP scope and had an average high severity of 30% of the fire, which is kind of around double what the average kind of high severity percentage has been for large fires in the area over many decades. So that was definitely eye-opening. And just in general, The region has been managed as an ignition limited system for over a century, rather than a fuels limited system, which is how it was for millennia, for forever before that. So that's kind of a huge shift in more recent in history that has really shaped and affected the paradigm that we're dealing with right now. So just to go over kind of the intent of our post-fire management recommendations, and then I'll get into some of those general recommendations. We're hoping that this can help us to kind of assist in the collaborative identification of desired future conditions post-fire. And this, we feel like post-fire management really needs to be based on the use of climate adaptation plans and best available science and traditional ecological knowledge. And were, as best as we could, develop these recommendations based on those. It's critical that we focus on how to restore fire process on the landscape and return to this fuel limited ecosystem that I was talking about. And that's just a really critical element of where our recommendations are headed. And it's essential that our management practices post-fire are complementing functional ecological processes and not working against them. And the kind of paradigm that we have been working in, fire suppression, and then perhaps intensive management afterwards, has really, in a lot of ways, worked against those functional ecological processes rather than with them. And it's really important that we're just clear that these recommendations don't supersede collaboration. And in fact, our first recommendation is that any post-fire management within the area and post-fire management plans really need to work collaboratively with WKRP partners and the community to make site-specific recommendations for that particular incident. Overall, it's really important that we just increase the pace and scale of beneficial fire processes on the landscape. And so that is kind of throughout all of our recommendations, kind of a base level of what we are needing to do to get to where we need to get. It's critical to ensure tribal consultation early and often, make sure that that occurs in a post-fire landscape as well as through the entire process. And a basic general recommendation is to prioritize the reintroduction of fire process in these recent fire footprints. And that's kind of one of the most essential elements of our recommendations. And in order to do that, we need to be designing NEPA that can facilitate the reapplication of fire in recent fire footprints, and also that will allow for the use of fire footprints as fuel limited areas adjacent to prescribed fires, cultural burns, and managed wildfire. So we recognize that fires are really doing the heavy lifting out here, and it's really essential that we are then taking advantage of that kind of fuel limited system to either bring fire process back into those footprints or use those footprints as a catcher's mitt for prescribed fire or managed wildfire in the future. Also, in order to do all of this, we need to write burn plans that allow for the utilization of these recent fire footprints to expedite safe restoration of historic fire regimes. And this includes indigenous fire use practices. So those are general recommendations. And now I'm going to get into some of the kind of more specific recommendations. And I should just say that There's a lot more details in the document, and so I'm just trying to pull out some of the things that seemed either most important or most specific to the WKRP partnership. So post-fire tree felling. Post-fire logging is a super controversial issue. It's even controversial within the partnership itself, although a lot of progress has been made in coming to agreement around a lot of different issues. And so what we're sharing, what I'm going to be sharing here and what we're sharing in the document are really the areas of agreement between WKRP partners. And those areas of agreement really center around two different areas. One is creating these implementable burn units to restore fire process in and adjacent to recent fire footprints. And the other is really post-fire tree felling for safety around homes, critical access routes, and infrastructure, and highly used areas around WUI, et cetera, where appropriate. Generally, these recommendations are not meant as an opportunity to recover costs or meet budget justification targets through salvage logging, but rather they're really to assist in reestablishing this historic fire regime, public safety, and restoration efforts where that's appropriate. And overall, we recommend not only using tree felling where it's really necessary. And I'll go into some more specifics of areas that there's agreement and that makes sense for the partnership. Really important, as discussed, is including prescribed fire burning in all NEPA for post-fire treatments. And that's not exactly tree felling, but it's really important in making this all possible. We recommend the use of tree felling as a tool for restoration in habitats impacted by conifer encroachment, if it seems like that makes sense on the land. So this is looking at areas that were encroached oak woodlands, encroached meadows, and oak savannas and things like that, which there are quite a few on the landscape. We would prioritize removal of trees in areas of the highest use, like mentioned, these critical access and egress routes, WUI areas adjacent to homes and around critical infrastructure, campgrounds, and other high use areas where hazard trees are a hazard to the public. We prioritize tree removal along strategic features that would allow us to be able to reapply fire and restoration of historic fire regimes. So these are, ridge tops, critical roads, those sorts of features that basically where tree felling is needed so that we can move forward and actually get fire back into these areas safely. Overall, we recommend not removing trees in riparian zones and fragile soils, and avoid making new roads in post-fire management. And we recommend that the engagement of fisheries biologists right away to start planning for the potential for directional felling in streams as appropriate for sediment retention and habitat. And this also includes potential for pulling trees over to become in-stream structures for fisheries habitat and sediment retention. So moving on to fuels and fire restoration recommendations. Generally, we believe that wildfires offer unique opportunities for restoring fire processes in and adjacent to their footprints. And the reduced fuels of these fire footprints really allow for a reduced risk of escape for prescribed fire, and also reduce costs of burns as a fuels treatment, both in being able to reduce cost of doing a prescribed burn, but also if we're taking advantage of these fire footprints while they're still relatively safe, they are a lot cheaper than coming back in and doing fuels treatments later on manually or mechanically. And also, these fire footprints often leave behind functional fuel breaks that can be used to manage future wildfires and prescribed fire. And that's really important to be maintaining and enhancing these fuel breaks so that they can be used for this essential process. The mosaic of previous fire footprints can guide planning for larger post-fire restoration actions that incorporate managed wildfire, cultural fire, and prescribed fire with reduced risk. So generally, just the same as we've been saying, it's really important to take advantage of these footprints, and wildfires are really doing the heavy lifting out there, and we should work off of that. More specific fire and fuels restoration recommendations are to focus treatments around WUI areas, including ingress and egress routes, to reduce the hazards to infrastructure, obviously, especially power lines. And with that, we recommend the creation of some sort of a power distribution hazard reduction plan that could be based on the Crook Tribe's PG&E report. And if you haven't seen this, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's important to survey new fire lines for at least 3 years for invasive species in order to keep invasive species really like to spread after these fires. And so it's really important that we survey for and treat these weeds before they take over the landscape and have other effects on future fire regimes. It's important to identify, enhance, and maintain these strategic control features for future use. And as part of this, identifying a reburn schedule for recent fire footprints and ensuring that there's NEPA coverage for the subsequent prescribed fire. We've thus far missed almost all of our opportunities to use this kind of mechanism within our area. And just because of not having all of these things in our pocket, not having NEPA so that we can actually go out and take advantage of these recent fire footprints, or maybe not maintaining these control features so that then it's really costly to go back in and use them. So it's super important to maintain fire footprints with appropriate fire return intervals to restore this historic fire regime. And just using these fire footprints as fuel limited areas, adjacent prescribed fire units, as mentioned before, is really important. We have an example of this here in Sawyer's Bar, where the 2014 wildfire footprint was able eventually to act as a catcher's mitt for a prescribed fire of about 1,500 acres behind the town of Sawyer's Bar in 2017. And we need to see a lot more of that. So erosion control. It's important to engage affected communities and organizations to collaboratively plan a burned area emergency response on private lands and tribal lands. And we would really like to see this be more of an all lands approach. And too often there's kind of plans for work around private or tribal lands, and then the private lands don't get that level of work to reduce erosion right away after fires. We recommend mapping areas with the greatest potential for stream contamination from burned infrastructure and developing plans for containment right away. And this is something that really jumped out with the Slater fire, with having a fire that, is burning through communities. Just the level of potential contamination is so much more than most of our wildfires. And again, working with fisheries biologists right away to understand the benefits of directional fouling for erosion control in hard to access areas, and also for a benefit for fisheries in stream. We also recommend designing sediment catchment basins along roads so that they don't pond up water on the uphill side of the road and then superheat this water that's supposed to be cold during the summer months, because every bit of cold water is essential, and especially in areas that recently burned. And then another thing that actually has started to see some progress, but is really important, is minimizing erosion on strategic fire lines without using excessive amounts of vegetation and slash, because this often results in making these fire lines unusable, either as a strategic feature for prescribed fire or for a future wildfire. And there have been lots of examples of this where they have essentially become hazards and wicks for fire. So let's not do that anymore. Forest heterogeneity. We really feel like wildfires are an opportunity to restore fire resiliency, and that we really need to see the silver lining in wildfires. As devastating as they can be on some areas, they really are. They are doing the heavy lifting, and they are treating fuels on a huge percentage of the acres here, much more than we are able to do with other management actions. And so we really need to take advantage of all of the opportunities that are within these wildfire events. So natural regeneration and invasive species management are really our top priorities for forest heterogeneity. And the goal of post-fire treatments really needs to be diverse, fire-resilient forests. Overall, we don't usually recommend planting because we feel like natural regeneration can really do the trick. However, if planting is considered necessary, then planting fire, drought, and disease-resistant species suitable for future climate conditions is really important. And using pre-suppression era vegetation patterns as a guide for this, both in species composition and how far apart plantings are. Wildfires can also create really important needed heterogeneity in plantations. So we recommend building on that and using, post-fire treatments to help in not just replanting those plantations, but using that as a tool for getting those plantations to be more diverse and building upon that with treatments. It's really important to protect and retain older conifers and hardwoods within fire footprints for heterogeneity, to maintain these local genetics, and also for wildlife habitat. And so this goes for these large, older conifers and hardwoods, and whether they are dead or alive. We also recommend, and this is starting to happen more, is just counting hardwood regeneration in stocking requirements, so that there's less pressure to be restocking with conifers, especially in areas where historically and climatically it doesn't make sense anymore. So for monitoring, one thing that really came up with the Slater fire is just the need for emergency response monitoring, being able to go out and do grab samples from creeks after first the first rains after a fire to really understand the aquatic and human impacts. And this is, of course, really important when you have structures and infrastructure and that kind of thing burning up, but also important with the use of fire retardants and other things. We recommend collaboratively developing site-specific fire monitoring plans for each fire event. And building out our research partnerships and intergenerational learning through the Karuk Department of Natural Resources Picayune Field Institute. We recommend the use of Western and Indigenous science data, and practices to inform place-based adaptations and monitoring plan updates as needed. And also feel like it's important for us to, within our area, to review regional and national post-fire erosion control techniques to understand best practices for our landscape and adapt them accordingly. So just in summary, the pace and scale of wildfires definitely appears to be increasing as a century of fire suppression and the cessation of indigenous burning is colliding with climate change and all of those impacts. Wildfires have and will continue to be the largest forms of fuels reduction on our landscape, and they're really going to be doing that heavy lifting. So how we prepare for, react to, and work with these forces will really affect both human and natural communities and how we can live and coexist in this environment moving forward. We're returning to a fuel limited system with each large wildfire that we have, whether we like it or not. So it's really important that we use these opportunities to maintain these burned areas as fuel limited and fire resilient landscapes into the future. And to do this, we really need to transition from a fire suppression mentality as our primary form of fire management to a model that relies on managing wildfires for resource objectives while increasing larger scale prescribed fire. And post-fire treatments are really a critical step in this management shift. And that's why we've taken the time to really dive in and put together recommendations. And that's it.
Thank you, Karuna. I don't see any questions in the question and answer. There is one statement recognizing that there's perhaps a difference in approach that different national forests take in their post-fire salvage and recovery restoration approaches. And then for that, in the interest of time, because we are getting a little bit further behind, I am going to introduce Chris Dunn, Dr. Chris Dunn from Oregon State University, who's going to talk to us about the pods and his research in that regard and working with WKRP. So thank you, Karuna. And then we have a chance. We'll get Chris on board.
I think you're muted, Chris.
Well, that's not so fun. Well,
There
thanks,
we
Will.
go. Good. Thank you, Chris.
Well, that was a great lead into what I want to talk about, which is a little less about the post-fire environment and more about being proactive and thinking about creating more of the post-fire environment, that we really desire and want, and how we can move our systems towards doing that.
Chris, can I interrupt? I see your, I think you need to switch the display settings so we can see more of your presentation on that. Let's see here. There we go. That looks like it. Thank you.
Nothing has changed. I haven't moved anywhere yet, so we haven't missed anything. You know, I'm sitting here, you know, thinking about the fires that impact our landscapes and what we experience collectively. We see in the media, we see on our landscapes, and And I always like to make the point that, you know, our fire suppression service is still effective at suppressing, say, 97 to 98% of the wildfires. And those are probably the wildfires that would provide greater ecological benefits if they were utilized to a greater extent. And so what we're really experiencing is that you know, top 2 or 3% of the worst fires, those that cause the most damage. And we can fundamentally shift that. That is a choice we are making collectively as a society to produce on our landscapes. And what we really need to do is flip that narrative and flip that interaction and relationship we have with our landscapes, with fire, and start to produce a different outcome across these broad landscapes. Because believe it or not, these fires are going to continue to come. They're going to continue to come in these extreme events and continue to negatively impact our landscapes. And we really want to flip that narrative and move to something different. And it can be done. It's just something that we all collectively have to share in the stewardship and responsibility to achieve. And that can be from our landscapes all the way down to our homes. And so I'm going to try to walk through a process that attempts to highlight a strategy at which we can get there. And this is really built off of a lot of expertise and knowledge with colleagues like you see on this list, but as well as a lot of interactions with public and the communities and just people that you know are sort of in tune and working with and around or interacting with our natural landscapes. And so it's a real compendium of knowledge of expertise that is well beyond just the science organizations and people that I have listed here. And so I'm going to try to move pretty fast to see if we can catch up. I have a lot of introductory material that much has been covered already. So I'm sorry if we flip through pretty quick. I wanted to sort of reflect on 2020 to some degree because it was quite a year, and it was quite a year for many reasons. You know, there were biblical in a sense, if you will. We had, you know, locust outbreaks all across the continent of Africa that were causing damages there. Of course, we had the pandemic, and that's impacted everybody globally. But despite these really other major disturbing events, you know, I still see 2020 as the year of fire, and I see it that way not only because of personal impacts, but because, you know, if you remember back to 2019 into 2020, and we started the year pre-pandemic thinking about these large wildfire events in Australia that ultimately burned 46 million acres, which is roughly the size of the state of Washington. You know, and this is their fire season. And of course that then, you know, went away as they came out of their fire season. And of course we went into ours, in California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado were deeply impacted by wildfire events here. And so, you know, we saw events like this within one day ramp up from, you know, fires that were occurring much across California. And then you can see this explosive events that occurred over here in Oregon as that east wind events really set in and new ignitions started. And then those fires that were already burning continued to expand. And so, you know, I think of a year of fire. And in Colorado, you know, I had friends at that same time sending me images like this and forecasts where we're really under snow, we're in burning, you know, and it's just this really strange outcomes and things happening across many of our landscapes in the Western US and more broadly globally. Just some of the strangest forecasts of outcomes. This is what my home looked like during those events. This is what my brother's home ended up looking like because of these events in Southern Oregon. So down in your neck of the woods. And then of course, many other people have experienced much worse outcomes than I experienced, or even my brother who is fine and settled now today. And all of this is taking a toll. It's taking a toll on our communities. It's taking a toll on our landscapes. And it's really taking a toll even on our firefighters. And while this is from Australia and it's colorful in nature, it's reflective of even how our firefighters are starting to feel, given this sort of constant pressure and the mental, emotional, and physical toll that these events are starting to take. And the point being is that this is
In New South Wales in Nelligan, west of Bateman's Bay,
Gouging us all.
firefighters are battling blazes whipped up by strong north to northwesterly winds. They're exhausted and they're at their wits' ends. Have a look at this.
You from the media, tell the Prime Minister to go and get from Nelligan. We really enjoy doing this head. Thank you very much. I've lost 7 houses already in Nelligan. I'm not going to lose any more, you head.
Stand down now. You don't deserve to govern. You knew this was coming. It's been coming for a few years. You've been totally ignorant of it. And now we're wearing your problem.
Tell the PM to come and meet me. Paul Parker from Nelligan. Meet you any day, pal.
It's somewhat humorous, but it is really reflective of, the state of where we're at in many parts of our fire-prone global systems right now. And it's not something that wasn't observable. There's a long, multi-millennial knowledge that has built that led to many strategies that prevented these type of outcomes that were fundamentally shifted, over 100 years ago with Euro-American colonization and shifts and desires from our landscapes. And there was a great debate even back at the early 20th century as to what's the best practices going forward. Timber industry really advocating for continuation of this light burning practices that were commonplace across much of the Western landscapes, with the Forest Service pushing back against that and saying, no, we actually need to create more timber supply across these lands, and then that can be a sustainable strategy moving into the future. And so there, this knowledge was imparted and transferred, but it wasn't heeded. It wasn't followed. And I don't, a lot of that is probably arrogance. A lot of that was naivety, and a lot of that was just a general disregard for the long history that many people had with the landscapes and understanding of these ecological systems. And we ultimately went down this path of aggressive fire suppression that has led to, increased fuels, much of what we all really know. And we've documented this. We've documented this, for decades and decades now, and we still haven't taken the action that actually will lead to positive outcomes. In part because, as these first things, the first science and realizations were coming out that our forests were becoming unsustainably dense and the fuels were increasing, came at a time when summers were cooler and wetter, which is really this period. So that paper I was showing in the images in the previous slide was around 1943. And so you see that densification of these forests. Well, that seemed somewhat sustainable given that our summer, we had increased summer precipitations and relatively moderate temperatures, and therefore our fire suppression organization was able to maintain its success. Well, we've clearly come out of that, and that short-sightedness that is pervasive within these systems and this development over the 20th century really started to unravel into what we see today. And this is, of course, what I was talking about with our initial attack success rate here. 98% is a common goal of our fire management organizations. They still largely achieve that, but even this modest, never 100%, but modest decline down to say 98, 97% has really resulted in this major increase in burned areas. And as I had stated before, those that are escaping this initial attack effort are those that are burning under the most severe fire weather conditions and creating those most severe outcomes. There's a whole nother suite, and the largest portion of our fires that ignite across landscapes that can burn with less intensity, less severity, and ultimately with more positive benefits. And those we're really trying to find a strategy to start to leverage those, to use those to a greater degree on these landscapes. And this is really that period. You see a period of greatest success was during that cooler, wetter period, something that is no longer here, something that was known for millennia, but disregarded for such a long period of time. And now we're really trying to find a strategy to reintegrate that. The cohesive strategy is the framework we're currently operating under here in the United States, and it does offer this opportunity, if it's leveraged correctly and used correctly, to have different outcomes moving into the future. They wanted to really target fire adapted communities, these resilient landscapes, and then safe and effective wildfire response. And that's really where I tend to reside in my research, is this safe and effective wildfire response, most notably in trying to shift that fire management organization to be more nuanced and responsive to the benefits of wildfire, to the application of wildfire on landscapes, and then to also improve their ability to suppress under those conditions and in those locations where that is needed and necessary to protect our communities and maybe watersheds and otherwise. And so really trying to shift that balance towards something new. We do know that adapting homes and communities can be highly beneficial to those individual homeowners and the survivability of their structures, as you can see here, even with a fairly intense fire. If you have that defensible space and you're maintaining your property correctly, and maintaining that home ignition zone, you can survive even these events when they're pretty extreme. And this is an image from the 2020 wildfires up here in Oregon, which burned under really, really intense fire weather conditions. Crown fires in the black, burning up towards these homes and these structures, and because they were built with the proper materials and had some defensible space, they were able to survive. So there is a role for individual community members to move towards that. We've seen a lot of images from Eric Knapp, and here's some more. We can adapt and restructure our forests, with thinning treatments and restoration treatments, so that is viable, and then we can start to reintroduce wildfire into these systems with much greater certainty of their outcomes, or their positive outcomes. And so building those resilient landscapes is a strategy forward, but it's difficult to get those to the pace and scale that matches the challenge that we're faced today. The sheer scale of the wildfires that are impacting our landscapes far exceed the amount of treatments that are being placed, which is why I put a lot of emphasis on shifting the fire management organization towards a different way of engaging with fire, so that they can provide those broader and larger scale outcomes that were being discussed in the previous talk. And we'll continue to discuss here. And here's an example of one that happened, of a fire that was managed for resource objectives here in Oregon. And, the fire line down here on this road through the valley, and then it burned up to a ridge and an old fire up top. And so it had pretty effective control locations around it already. And they were able to manage this with the outcomes that you can see here, which pretty low intensity fire at this broader landscape scale. Now, this obviously is restoring fire to the landscape. That also, it starts to restructure the forest. It also provides this risk reduction benefit at a very large scale, and a very large scale that can be effective at aiding suppression and management of the next large wildfire. And this is pretty evident when you look at that Slater fire that, of course, we're all very familiar with down in this neck of the woods. On the right is the severity map, and it shows the outcome of that fire, but it also shows the sheer intensity at which that fire was burning, given that wind event that was really helping push it. And you can notice this ridge line on the right side here, and how stark it is that it's burning with high severity, and then it backed down, I would presume, against the wind, in a very low intensity burn along that eastern edge there. Well, the fire trying to move west ran into, as you can see now in the left image, some recent fire events. So 2017 and 2018 fires here. All of these polygons of fire in blue and green that you see around here are within the last 5 years in this landscape. And you can see how beneficial they are as potential control locations across this landscape. So the cooler colors are higher control opportunities for our fire management service. And you can see how limited they are across much of the landscape, except when you have these large fire polygons. And in this case, even under this this really intense fire, it was able to halt its progression to the west. It ended up moving to the north until it spilled out across the northern tip of those old fires. and then was able to spread west and challenge these communities in Oregon here. But this is really, these are maps that we create, these potential control location maps that we deliver to these incidents, and we integrate these fire polygons, and you can really see how beneficial they are towards managing future fire events. So we bring a lot of analytics, and this is a process that we're working through in the WKRP area and more broadly across the North Coast Resource Partnership area, where we work with potential control location atlases, which is the image that you just saw previously, develop a quantitative wildfire risk assessment that does assess that fire outcomes on the values we place on our landscapes. And then we also integrate the suppression difficulty index, which is another measure of firefighter effectiveness at portions of across these landscapes, as well as a measure of how much work may have to occur at a fire line should that be chosen as the primary containment unit, so that because there's always this major effort that the firefighters have to put out on the landscape. And so we develop these in advance, and we can start to plan with these tools, and we can start to develop response strategies with these tools, and start to really begin to shift that narrative and that perspective towards, all right, how do we leverage more fire for resource objectives to not only return fire to these landscapes as an ecological process, but to also provide these broader risk reduction benefits that can really, really protect our communities and our watersheds across broader landscapes. And this video will demonstrate how that all fits together.
Welcome back to the Ponderosa Pine National Forest, where staff are working together with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team to create more proactive wildfire risk management plans. One of the challenges of spatial fire planning is identifying control locations where operations can be safer and have a higher likelihood of success. This is especially important because control opportunities often don't align with ownership boundaries. With a plan in mind ahead of time, everyone involved can be clear on the best actions to take, even in a cross-boundary fire. The science team brings several tools to the table for this effort. The basic ingredients of these tools are intuitive and designed to complement local expertise and judgment. Quantitative wildfire risk assessments, suppression difficulty index, and potential control locations that help form potential wildfire operational delineations, also known as PODs. The quantitative risk assessment uses fire modeling and expert analysis to estimate benefits and losses from fire. Suppression Difficulty Index provides an assessment of the potential hazards and opportunities for fire responders by balancing expected fire behavior with access and mobility. The Atlas of Potential Control Locations maps local conditions where fire lines have and have not been effective in the past, and provides a measure of operational opportunities and challenges for suppression. By overlaying suppression difficulty and potential control locations on a map of quantitative wildfire risk, we develop PODs that summarize risks to important values while highlighting opportunities to effectively engage fire. The science team is already deploying these tools in planning applications on National Forest System lands across the western United States, including for real-time decision support on dozens of large fires. Incident management teams use these tools to prioritize responder safety and assess suppression opportunities on fire operations. And forest managers and their neighbors, like here on the Ponderosa, use these tools to integrate fire into landscape planning, prioritize fuel treatments, and create or improve control opportunities to reduce risk to things they value. Can the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team help with assessment and response planning in your area? Contact us to find out how we can help your forest and neighbors plan for the next fire.
So we created that to be a nice summary of the process that we employ and the intent of what we're trying to get through this process, and what we commonly referred to as the PODS process. I'll give you a couple, we'll sort of step through some of this with maps just to sort of see it and see it in a real world example for, in this case, the Stanislaus National Forest. I do have an additional prioritization framework that follows that I did for the city of Ashland, just over the hill from you guys to the north. But I think we'll go ahead and reserve that if only those questions come up, just so that I don't stand in the way of your lunch as we get there. But if we have questions, we can bring those up and talk about how we may go about prioritizing fuel break treatments to enhance the opportunities to use more fire across the landscape or at the stand scale. But I do want to sort of walk through this really quickly so that we can see it play out. Now, you noted we create these potential control location atlases, and here you can see it for the Stanislaus National Forest. In this case, stopped at the forest boundary. We typically like to go into an all lands environment, but they were particular towards management of the national forest lands only, as well as the inholdings that are within that. And then this is a specific project area in black that you see here. So it's called the Cerro Project, but we won't go into that too much today. It'll just be on the map so you know what it is. But here you can see the potential control location maps, the High Sierra granite up here. The cooler colors have a higher probability of being a good control location or opportunity for fire management organizations, scaling down into the red that are less opportunistic and more challenging environments to work for. Suppression difficulty index can highlight some really difficult and challenging portions of the landscape to engage in. It's really a balance of potential fire behavior with the ability of firefighters to be mobile and access portions of those landscapes, either via roads or trails, how steep the slopes are, what type of soil are we talking about that makes mobility more challenging. And then, we really integrate that local knowledge. We work with your local fire management service. We work with local communities. We work with local practitioners to ingest their knowledge so that this, the analytics aren't only driving the process, and neither is our local knowledge, because both can be misguided or biased in certain ways. And so we really want to blend the two so that we get the best outcome. And that's what you see here in this third map is their delineations of those pods, these operational delineations, really identifying their best chance of where they could catch a fire, should there be one that ignites within there. And then under the right conditions, ideally, we could leverage those fires and bring them out to those boundaries or some other boundary to start to really increase the footprint of good fire on these landscapes. Now, we also like to fold in a quantitative wildfire risk assessment, because that assessment can be very informative to how we make these decisions about prioritizing suppression response, what our strategic response should be, and how we may prioritize even fuels treatments, or as we were discussing previously, where we may need to salvage log, or where we can let those early soil environments develop naturally, so that we're continuing to work with how firefighters need to engage in the landscape moving forward under those ideas of being able to burn the burn and move the system into the future in a more strategic way. And so with these quantitative risk assessments, you can get burn probability maps. You see this big green blotch to the south here was the rim fire, which we saw some images before. And at least at the time when we did the fire simulations, this the benefit of that fire on reducing the potential for another ignition spreading across the landscape was still evident. And that, of course, is dynamic and changes over time, and likely today's conditions, it would be burnable, and it's starting to trend towards this red again, unless we can get in there and continue to add fire and keep this system in a fuel reduced state. With the quantitative risk assessment, we get what we call conditional net value change. So the impacts on the values we place on the landscape should a fire occur. We can blend these two together, essentially multiply them and get expected net value change. And that starts to highlight areas where our values are most likely to be impacted. And of course, that can inform then how we respond in wildfire. Should we have multiple ignitions, as well as how we may think about allocating other mitigation actions to minimize the losses that may occur across a landscape. And then ultimately we can start to look at informing that wildfire response to a much greater degree in what we call strategic response zones. We typically categorize these into three, which one is termed maintain, and that is that the values that are present and the likelihood of a fire spreading from that location and negative impacting values outside of the pod are low, and therefore fire should and could and should be used to meet resource objectives. And then we have a restore pod where under the right conditions, this category suggests that under the right conditions, you could use fire. So you just need to be cognizant that it's burning under the right conditions, which in many cases they are, and certainly on the shoulder seasons. And then there's those protect zones where there's such high density of values that fire suppression remains critical there until we can start to really address the risk through other mitigation actions. And so we can start to stratify broad landscapes based on this categorization and really start to leverage areas for more fire to meet resource objectives. And so this is just walk through how that process is. This is a simple, what we call in situ summary, which is a simple summation of the conditional net value change within the pod boundaries after they're decided. So this is, you know, all, and I just categorize it as positive or negative, right? So when you sum that up, it's fire most likely to have negative outcomes or positive outcomes. And as you can see here, the landscape is largely split. As you get towards the lower country in the valleys where there's more homes, you start to really see those negative outcomes versus the positive outcomes up in the higher Sierras. Now we integrate then that potential for spreading outside of that pod and either positively or negatively impacting other values. And when we do so, you can see the expanded footprint up into portions of the higher Sierras because of the abundance of infrastructure and inholdings that are present higher up there, that if a fire did spread out of one of these pods that maybe internally weren't going to result in negative outcomes, if it did spread outside of that, it would result in negative outcomes. And so we're sort of moderating some of that potential just to be a little more conservative because of the potential outcomes. And then we put these together. And so simply if it's, you know, negative outcomes are red and red in both cases, then that is what we consider a protect zone. That means that fire is likely to have negative outcomes in the current state of the landscape and that fire suppression should be pursued until other mitigation actions could unravel that, which may not be ever possible. It may always be a prescribed fire or thinning treatment area. And then if it's blue and blue, that is positive outcomes and positive outcomes, even from those that are likely to spread out of there, then those would be the areas where our default strategy should be use more fire here. That is what we assess as the right strategy and the right outcome for our landscapes. And therefore, if you're suppressing, you're actually working against what we believe will be the best outcome for that portion of this broader national forest. And then if it's mixed, that's that restore pod where, you know, under the right conditions, you could probably use fire, but otherwise you would need to continue to suppress. And you get an outcome that looks like this. And so now we've diversified this national forest based on that potential to use fire, whether it's our default strategy or it's that potential under the right conditions versus those areas where we need to really focus our efforts for aggressive suppression to protect those values that we place across that landscape. And then we can use this in that real response world to as we start to engage with the next year's ignitions. And then ideally continue to accumulate positive fires across this landscape that can then provide the resource objectives that we desire, including that significant risk reduction that occurs with it. And so given the state of time, I'm going to go ahead and flip through these prioritization frameworks. We can talk about this either through Q&A at the end, or somebody can reach out to me anytime and we can talk about it. but I'll go ahead and stop there. Let my twins tell me when to stop talking about fire, and that'll be now. And with that, we'll turn it over to Frank and others.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Great informative stuff. I always learn something new more about the pods process, and I appreciate you contributing that to our workshop today. I did put in the chat, if folks don't mind going over a few more minutes here into your lunchtime. I did see there was a few questions in the question and answer regarding post-fire management, or even thinking about the future fire management of looking at areas that would potentially manage to change from more conifer dominated into hardwood, particularly black oak, and how that may facilitate the reintroduction of fire and more positive fire management in areas rather than responding to just wildfires after other trajectories. So is any of the attendees here, attendees have your comments or questions in there rather for the panelists? And if there's any panelists here who want to take on any of those general questions regarding around, well, that one had to really do about, can large areas of black oak dominated southerly slopes provide frequent fuel bed needed for dormant season burning in a manner that sequesters carbon in the soils while protecting communities from northeast wind events at other more severe times of the year or intensive times of the year? So that was one of those general things, but that's all. That was some of the main questions that we had, our discussion for the panelists.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't know too much work on looking at the black carbon storage from the prescribed fire, but I gave the example that Carl Skinner worked at Shasta Lake with frequent burning in the dormant season in black oak stands. And so if that's a strategy, I think it's a really logical one, and he could talk more about the outcomes there. And you could certainly do modeling to kind of show what that would look like in terms of the risk to communities. That seems like a really good idea to pursue.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any other panelists have any thoughts or reflections to
I
that?
was just going to add that anecdotally in the Bear Country landscape where I grew up and my folks live on the Salmon River, the 77 fire and 87 fire burned through those areas. And then 87 fire was really quite intense through that area. And on the private lands where basically the hardwoods were allowed to regenerate, the black oaks came back really strongly. And with fuels reduction, and that, whereas on the federal lands there was a lot more plantations and that sort of thing. But those areas with some fuels reduction, and certainly the areas where there has been even on the small scale kind of some frequent fire, seem to be much more safe as far as the communities go. And you can really see this kind of night and day shift when you go from private land to federal land in that area. I don't know about the carbon sequestration, but just anecdotally, it seems like a lot of our mid-elevation areas that are southwest facing and have those elements in them come back really nicely like that, and it really makes sense.
Thank you, Karuna. Any other thoughts or responses from other panelists?
Yeah, I tend to look at the landscape through the lens of firefighters. And if you think about those, those oak woodland or oak savannas, whichever one you may be in, and it's got that grass understory, certainly it's burnable and burnable often, but it's also very predictable and understandable, and you can see well, and you can operate in that kind of environment so much easier. And there's clearly a reduced potential for crown fires, and therefore you're really creating a system of being able to respond more effectively without really the potential negative outcomes from a very intense fire spreading across a plantation or otherwise. And so I think that going into that sort of broader oak system, particularly around your community, certainly provides a lot of benefits on how firefighters can interact and either a prescribed fire context or a wildfire response context. And it's a really good outcome and direction that I would recommend striving for.
You know, one of the elements that came up as a theme was, you know, returning to historic fire regimes. And we have to recognize that, particularly in this area of the Klamath, so much of that historic fire regime was indeed an indigenous influence cultural fire regime. And we talk about complex early cereal and these oak woodlands and more yellow pine, ponderosa, sugar pine, other habitat dominated parts of the landscape. And, you know, this is a chance for recovery, especially as we go into climatic change of warmer, drier conditions. Having areas that are a little bit less dense in fuels and tree dense, and then also really building upon those complex early cereal habitats like the prairies and meadows, oak woodlands, pines, more actually shrub dominant areas were historically more prevalent. If you see the Louislander and some of the other early historic vegetation mapping from the late 1800s and 1910, 1930 era. So those are just things to be thinking about. Is, you know, again, what characteristics of the landscape and the way we want to live with fire, and what are some of those diversity as well as conservation or other attributes that we have as a shared vision and represent our values on this landscape. So those are my parting thoughts. I do want to appreciate everything. I want to acknowledge and appreciate our presenters. And if I am missing, here we go. We got a question. Has anybody ever, I don't understand what Will Harling's question is here about carpet bomb burned areas with acorns. I'm not sure whether you're asking, Will, so you're going to have to chime in there, because I burn for acorns, but I don't know if I carpet bombed them.
I meant dropped them out of planes in large quantities in areas that, you know, burned at high severity that were once
Oh, God, okay.
stands. So I was, you know, just somebody mentioned that the other day, if it had ever been tried, and I thought Jonathan or somebody else might have seen instances of or heard of instances of that.
No, and for people who aren't familiar as acorn gatherers, you really need to proactively manage your acorn crop under your orchard trees to reduce the weevil and the moth, because in many cases people think, oh, there's lots of acorns under these trees, but when you actually start cracking them and looking at them, if they're not burned or cleared out, you have such high infestation rates, most of those acorns are not viable. So you may have a masting event, but if the pests aren't managed, then there's gonna be less viability that you could. So you might be dropping a bunch of wormy acorns out there, depending on where you gather them. Anyways, well, I appreciate everybody, our panelists, particularly for presenting this morning. I say we take a 15-minute break now for lunch and come right back at 12:30. And we'll be getting into our next session, which will be the moderator and later on talking about prescribed burn associations and the training exchange burns, fire curriculum, intergenerational learning, workforce development. And we'll be hearing from Linya, Margot, and Will on that one. So again, thank you for putting that up, Jody, and enjoy the few minutes that you have here. We'll see you back here soon in a few minutes. 12:30. We'll get a fresh start on it.